In a small Midwestern town, Lucas, a former firefighter haunted by his past, rescues a stray dog from an icy river during a storm. Naming her Layla, he devotes himself to her recovery, facing sleepless nights and emotional challenges. Through patience and love, Layla transforms from a terrified, fragile creature into a strong, confident companion. Along the way, Lucas confronts his own fears and guilt, finding healing in their shared journey. The story reaches its climax when Layla bravely defends Lucas from intruders, proving her resilience and trust in him. Together, they face the lingering shadows of their past at the very river that once symbolized pain, turning it into a place of renewal. By the end, Layla thrives as a symbol of second chances, inspiring Lucas to embrace the future with hope. This heartwarming story celebrates resilience, the power of second chances, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. What did you think about Layla and Lucas's journey? Do you have a favorite part of their story? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, DG Story, for more inspiring tales of courage, hope, and transformation. Stay tuned for more amazing stories. The rain had not stopped for 3 days straight. In the small Midwestern town of Elkhorn, the swollen Rockwood River raged through its banks, carrying with it broken branches, discarded trash, and even pieces of small docks torn from upstream. The relentless storm had left most residents indoors, watching from their windows as nature unleashed its fury. The sky remained a dull gray, mirroring the mood of one Lucas Miller. Lucas, a 28-year-old former firefighter, sat in his truck, parked on the edge of a narrow bridge spanning the river. He had been avoiding this route since the storm began, unwilling to risk driving over the aging structure in such treacherous conditions. But today, he had no choice. His sister Rachel had insisted he join her for dinner at her home across town, and Lucas, though reluctant, finally agreed. As he drove cautiously over the bridge, something unusual caught his eye. Amid the swirling debris in the river, a small figure struggled against the current. At first, he thought it was a broken branch or a large bag, but then it moved, paddled. His heart sank as he realized it was a dog, clinging to a piece of wood as the river carried it downstream. "No," Lucas muttered to himself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He slowed his truck to a stop at the edge of the bridge, his pulse quickening. He watched as the dog's thin body trembled, its legs desperately clawing at the water. For a moment, Lucas froze. Memories of another rescue mission flashed through his mind, one where he had not been quick enough, where he had failed. His stomach churned with doubt. But then he heard the bark, weak but determined. The sound cut through the roar of the river and pierced his heart. "I can't just leave it," he muttered, shoving the truck into park and grabbing the spare rope he always kept under the seat. "Hang on, buddy." He sprinted to the riverbank, his boots slipping on the muddy ground. The dog's head bobbed dangerously low in the water, and Lucas's chest tightened, tying one end of the rope around his waist. He secured the other to a tree trunk and waded into the freezing water. The cold bit into his skin through his jeans, stealing his breath. But he pushed forward, his eyes locked on the dog. The current was stronger than he expected, nearly sweeping him off his feet. He stumbled but managed to stay upright, his hands reaching for the dog just as its grip on the wood slipped. "Got you," he said through gritted teeth, his arms wrapping around the trembling body. The dog let out a feeble whimper but didn't struggle, too exhausted to resist. Lucas tightened his grip and turned back toward the shore, every step a battle against the river's relentless force. His muscles burned, and his heart pounded, but he refused to let go. After what felt like an eternity, his boots finally found solid ground. He collapsed onto the muddy bank, the dog limp in his arms. "You're okay," Lucas whispered, cradling the dog close as it shivered violently. His fur was soaked. Clinging to its frail frame, he pulled off his jacket and wrapped it around the dog, shielding it from the biting wind. You're safe now. The drive back to his cabin was tense. The dog lay motionless on the passenger seat, its breathing shallow but steady. Lucas turned the heater to full blast, glancing over every few seconds to make sure it was still alive. He hadn't planned for this, but now that the dog was in his care, he knew he couldn't abandon it. By the time he reached his cabin on the outskirts of Elkhorn, night had fallen. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, but the air remained cold and damp. Lucas carried the dog inside, carefully laying it on a blanket near the fireplace. He stoked the fire until the room was warm, then fetched a bowl of water and an old towel. The dog's eyes flickered open as Lucas gently dried its fur. "Hey there, buddy," he said softly. "You're a tough one, aren't you?" The dog's tail gave the faintest wag, a flicker of life that brought a small smile to Lucas's face. "I think I'll call you Layla," he said. The name, coming to him unexpectedly, felt right, somehow. "You look like a Layla." Layla's eyes closed again, her body relaxing slightly under the warmth of the fire and Lucas's care. For the first time in a long while, Lucas felt a glimmer of purpose. But he knew this was just the beginning. Layla's journey to recovery, and perhaps his own, was far from over. Lucas stared at Layla as she lay motionless near the fire. Her breathing was shallow, her ribs visible through her wet fur. He felt a lump in his throat as he realized how close she had come to death. The heat of the fire had begun to warm her trembling body, but her condition was far from stable. Lucas knew he had to act quickly if she were to have any chance of survival. He rushed to the kitchen, rummaging through the cabinets for something suitable to feed her. He found a can of chicken soup, poured it into a pot, and heated it on the stove. The aroma filled the small cabin, mingling with the scent of damp earth and smoke from the fire. Lucas carefully poured the warm broth into a shallow bowl and placed it next to Layla. "Come on, girl," he coaxed gently, kneeling beside her. "You need this." Layla's ears twitched at his voice, but she didn't move. Lucas dipped his finger into the broth and held it near her nose. After a moment, her tongue flicked out, weakly licking the liquid from his hand. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Encouraged, Lucas repeated the process until Layla managed to lift her head and lap at the bowl. He smiled, a small glimmer of hope breaking through his concern. But his relief was short-lived. A knock at the door startled both Lucas and Layla. She flinched, her body tensing as her eyes darted toward the sound. Lucas stood, glancing at the clock. It was well past midnight. He grabbed a flashlight and opened the door to find Rachel standing on the porch, her raincoat dripping. "Lucas, what the hell are you doing?" she demanded, her voice a mix of worry and exasperation. "Why aren't you answering your phone? I've been calling for hours." "I didn't hear it," Lucas replied curtly, stepping aside to let her in. "What are you doing here?" "I was worried about you," Rachel said, shaking off her coat. "And now I see why." Her eyes landed on Layla, who shrank back under her blanket. "Is that a dog?" "Yes," Lucas said firmly. "I pulled her out of the river earlier tonight." Rachel sighed, running a hand through her damp hair. "Lucas, you can't keep doing this. You can't save everyone." "I'm not trying to save everyone," he shot back, his voice rising. "Just her." Rachel softened, her gaze shifting between her brother and the trembling dog. "She looks bad, Lucas, really bad. You need to take her to a vet." "I'll call in the morning," Lucas said, crouching back down beside Layla. "She just needs rest for now." Rachel hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but you can't do this alone." Rachel sat down on the old, worn-out armchair by the fire, her gaze fixed intently on Layla. The dog's fragile body trembled under the blanket, and every shallow breath she took seemed louder in the stillness of the room. For the first time in a long while, Rachel's usual sharp demeanor softened as she absorbed the gravity of the situation. "She's in bad shape, Lucas, worse than I thought," she murmured, her voice low but filled with concern. Lucas nodded silently, his focus never leaving Layla. I know. That's why I'm staying with her. She's already been through hell. I can't just hand her off to someone else now." His voice was steady, but there was a crack of emotion hidden beneath the words. Rachel sighed, leaning forward and resting her elbows on her knees. "I get it, but taking care of a dog in this condition isn't something you can handle alone. What if she's sick? What if there's something you don't know how to deal with?" "I'll figure it out," Lucas replied firmly. He reached out, adjusting the edge of the blanket covering Layla. The dog's eyes fluttered open briefly, her tail twitching ever so slightly. It was a faint but undeniable sign of life. Lucas felt a surge of determination, his resolve hardening. "She's alive because I brought her here. That means she's my responsibility now." Rachel studied her brother for a long moment before leaning back in the chair. "You don't have to do this alone," she said softly. "Call the vet. Lucas, tonight. They'll know what to do." Lucas hesitated, the suggestion weighing heavily on him. He knew Rachel was right. Layla's condition could worsen overnight, and he wasn't equipped to handle a medical emergency. But the thought of handing her over to strangers, of possibly losing control over her care, made his chest tighten. "Tomorrow," he said at last. "If she's not better by morning, I'll call." Rachel opened her mouth to argue but stopped herself. Instead, she got up and made her way to the kitchen. Lucas could hear the clatter of cabinets and the quiet hum of the stove as she prepared a pot of tea. A few minutes later, she returned, holding 2 steaming mugs. "At least let me stay tonight," she said, handing Lucas a cup and sitting back down. "You've been through a lot today, if nothing else. I'll keep an eye on her while you get some rest." Lucas shook his head, his grip tightening on the cup. "I'm not leaving her. Not tonight." Rachel didn't argue further. Instead, she fetched a blanket from the couch and draped it over Lucas's shoulders. "Fine, but keep warm. At least, you won't be much help if you get sick." The night dragged on, the hours marked by the soft crackling of the fire and the rhythmic sound of Layla's breathing. Lucas sat beside her, his hand resting lightly on her back, feeling the faint rise and fall of her chest. Rachel dozed off in the armchair, her quiet snores blending with the steady hum of the room. As the early hours of the morning crept in, Lucas's thoughts began to wander. He recalled the faces of those he had failed to save during his time as a firefighter, the guilt that had driven him into isolation. Looking down at Layla, he wondered if she could sense his doubts and fears. "I won't let you down," he whispered, the words more for himself than for her. "Not this time." Just before dawn, Layla stirred more noticeably. Her head lifted slightly from the blanket, and her eyes fluttered open. Lucas leaned forward, his heart pounding. "Hey, girl," he murmured, his voice soft and full of hope. Her eyes met his for the briefest moment before she lowered her head again. But that fleeting connection was enough. Layla was fighting, and Lucas knew he would fight just as hard for her. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the cabin windows, Rachel woke with a start. She glanced at the armchair clock. Barely 6 a.m. The fire had burned low, leaving only faint embers glowing in the hearth. She rubbed her eyes and looked over to find Lucas still sitting on the floor beside Layla, his back leaning against the couch. His eyes were bloodshot, but he was awake, his hand resting protectively on the dog's frail frame. "You didn't sleep at all, did you?" Rachel asked, her voice hoarse from sleep. "I couldn't," Lucas admitted, his gaze fixed on Layla. She stirred a few times, drank a little water, but he trailed off, his expression a mix of exhaustion and worry. Rachel knelt beside him, her tone softening. "She's hanging in there, Lucas, but you've got to let someone help. Someone who knows what they're doing." Before Lucas could respond, Layla moved again, more deliberately this time. She shifted her weight, her head rising off the blanket with visible effort. Both siblings froze, watching as Layla let out a small, wheezy whimper. "Hey, girl," Lucas said softly, leaning closer. "You're okay. You're safe." Layla's eyes flicked between him and Rachel before she stretched her thin neck toward the bowl of water nearby. Her movements were slow and shaky, but the determination in her was unmistakable. Lucas quickly brought the bowl closer, steadying it as Layla took a few weak laps. "That's it," Rachel said, her voice breaking into a smile. "She's a fighter." Lucas allowed himself a faint smile but couldn't shake the lingering doubt. He knew better than to take this small progress as a sign of recovery. Layla was still dangerously fragile, and every moment without professional care felt like a gamble. "Okay," he said finally, breaking the silence. "We'll call the vet, but I'm not leaving her." Rachel nodded, relief washing over her face. "I'll drive us. You can hold her in the back seat." Within the hour, they were on the road, Lucas cradling Layla in his arms as Rachel navigated the winding streets toward the town's only veterinary clinic. The dog's body was warm under the blanket Lucas had wrapped her in, but her breathing remained shallow, her strength still fleeting. The clinic was quiet when they arrived, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the sterile waiting room. A middle-aged vet named Dr. Harper met them almost immediately, her kind eyes taking in the scene with practiced calm. "She's malnourished and severely dehydrated," Dr. Harper said after her initial examination. "But her vitals are stable, which is a good sign. She's got a long road ahead of her, though." Lucas exhaled, the weight of the night lifting slightly. "What do we need to do?" "For now, fluids and rest," the vet explained. "I'll give her something to help with the pain and make sure she's comfortable. But she'll need constant care, small, frequent meals, and a safe space to recover." Lucas nodded, already forming a plan in his mind. "She'll have that, whatever she needs." Rachel glanced at her brother, her skepticism giving way to admiration. For the first time, she saw a glimpse of the Lucas she remembered, the one who never gave up on anyone. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Harper handed Lucas a small bottle of medication. "You saved her life," she said, her tone sincere. "Most dogs in her condition wouldn't have made it through the night. She's lucky to have found you." "No," Lucas replied, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm the lucky one." The drive back to Lucas's cabin felt longer than usual, even though the morning sun had finally broken through the gray clouds. Layla rested in Lucas's lap, her head barely lifting as he whispered reassuring words to her. Rachel drove in silence, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror, her concern evident. Once they arrived, Lucas carefully carried Layla inside, settling her back onto the blanket by the fire. The warmth of the cabin seemed to soothe her, though her thin frame still shivered occasionally. Dr. Harper's instructions echoed in Lucas's mind as he moved methodically, setting up a corner of the living room with everything Layla might need: bowls of water, soft towels, and a small space heater to keep her warm. "Are you sure you've got this?" Rachel asked, lingering near the door. Her tone was softer now, less critical. "I'll figure it out," Lucas replied, crouching beside Layla. He gently stroked her head, his fingers brushing over her soft ears. "She just needs time, and someone to believe in her." Rachel hesitated before stepping closer. "You're putting a lot on yourself, Lucas. What if it's too much?" Lucas looked up at his sister, his jaw tightening. "She's alive because of me. I can't give up on her." Rachel nodded, recognizing the determination in his voice. "All right, but if you need anything, you call me. Promise." "Promise," Lucas said, though his focus was already back on Layla. Once Rachel left, the cabin fell quiet except for the crackling of the fire. Lucas sat beside Layla, spooning small amounts of the nutrient-rich broth Dr. Harper had prescribed into her mouth. First, she resisted, her weak body twitching slightly at the unfamiliar sensation. But Lucas was patient, murmuring softly as he coaxed her to take in more. "You've got this, girl," he said, his voice steady. "One step at a time." Hours passed in this rhythm, feeding, resting, checking her breathing. Layla began to respond more, her eyes fluttering open longer. her head turning slightly toward Lucas whenever he spoke. It was slow progress, but progress nonetheless. As the day turned to evening, Lucas sat back against the couch, exhaustion pulling at him. His mind drifted to memories of the past, of nights spent in the firehouse, waiting for calls that often came too late. He clenched his fists, the guilt from those moments creeping in. But then he looked at Layla, her chest rising and falling steadily now. She was still here. "You're stronger than you look," he whispered, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. For the first time in months, Lucas felt a flicker of hope, not just for Layla but for himself. The following days settled into a quiet routine. Lucas dedicated every waking moment to Layla's care, setting alarms to ensure she was fed small, frequent meals throughout the day and night. Her progress was slow but steady. Her once lifeless eyes now followed Lucas as he moved around the cabin. And though she was too weak to stand, her ears perked up at the sound of his voice. "Good girl," Lucas murmured as he gently stroked her side one afternoon. Layla let out a soft whimper, but there was no fear in it this time, only a quiet acknowledgement of his presence. Despite the progress, the strain of the situation began to weigh on Lucas. Sleepless nights, constant worry, and the lingering doubts in his mind made the cabin feel smaller, the air heavier, every time Layla refused a bite of food or shifted uneasily in her sleep. Lucas's chest tightened with anxiety. One evening, as Lucas prepared another bowl of broth, a loud knock on the door broke the silence. He sighed, already guessing who it might be. When he opened the door, Rachel stood there, a bag of groceries in one hand and a disapproving look on her face. "You're not answering your phone again," she said, brushing past him into the cabin. "I've been busy," Lucas replied, closing the door behind her. Rachel placed the groceries on the counter and turned to face him. "You look exhausted," she said bluntly, "and don't tell me you're fine, because you're not. When's the last time you slept?" Lucas rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding her gaze. "I'm managing." Rachel crossed her arms, her voice softening. "Lucas, I get it. You feel responsible for her, but you can't pour from an empty cup. If you burn out, who's going to take care of her?" Lucas glanced at Layla, who was resting near the fire, her head propped on a folded towel. He knew Rachel was right, but admitting it felt like a failure. "She needs me," he said quietly. "And you need help," Rachel countered, her tone gentle but firm. "I'm not saying you have to give her up. Just let me take some of the load. You're not in this alone." "Lucas." For a moment, Lucas hesitated. The idea of relinquishing even a small part of the responsibility felt wrong, as though it might diminish his connection with Layla. But then he looked at Rachel, her unwavering determination, and realized she wasn't trying to take over. She was trying to share the weight. "All right," he said finally, his shoulders sagging in relief. "You can help." Rachel smiled, a rare warmth in her expression. "Good. Now, sit down and eat something. I'll take care of her for a bit." As Lucas watched Rachel kneel beside Layla, gently feeding her and speaking softly, a knot of tension in his chest began to loosen. For the first time since this journey began, he felt like he wasn't alone. The days turned into a week, and Layla's transformation, though gradual, was undeniable. Her eyes, once dull and clouded with exhaustion, now held a spark of curiosity. She began to lift her head more often, even wagging her tail faintly when Lucas or Rachel spoke to her. Each small milestone felt like a victory, a reminder of why Lucas had taken this on in the first place. One crisp morning, Lucas decided it was time for Layla to take her first steps outside. The idea filled him with equal parts excitement and apprehension. She had been confined to the warmth of the cabin since the day he brought her home, and though she was stronger now, she was still far from fully recovered. "You sure she's ready for this?" Rachel asked as Lucas gently clipped a makeshift leash to Layla's collar. "She needs to feel the sun on her face," Lucas replied, determination in his voice. "We'll take it slow." carrying Layla to the porch. Lucas set her down on a soft blanket he'd spread over the wooden planks. The dog sniffed the air, her nose twitching as she took in the unfamiliar sense of the outdoors. Her ears perked slightly at the chirping of birds, and for a moment, she seemed almost at ease. "Good girl," Lucas said softly, crouching beside her. He gave the leash a gentle tug, encouraging her to take a step. Layla hesitated, her legs trembling as she tried to push herself up. She faltered, collapsing back onto the blanket with a frustrated whimper. Lucas's heart sank, but he refused to let it show. "It's okay," he said, stroking her head gently, "one step at a time. Remember." After a few moments of rest, Layla tried again. This time, she managed to stand, her legs shaky but holding. Lucas stayed close, his hand hovering near her for support as she took her first tentative step onto the porch. Rachel, who had been watching from the doorway, clapped her hands softly. "That's it. Layla, you've got this." Layla's tail wagged faintly at the sound of encouragement, and Lucas couldn't help but smile. It was a small step, but it meant the world. As Layla explored the porch, her steps grew steadier. She sniffed at the edges of the railing, her nose brushing against the rough wood. When a breeze rustled the nearby trees, she froze for a moment, her ears flattening. Lucas knelt beside her, speaking softly. "You're safe," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Nothing's going to hurt you." Layla turned her head toward him, her eyes meeting his. In that moment, Lucas felt an unspoken bond between them, a connection forged through shared struggle and quiet resilience. By the time they returned inside, Layla was exhausted but visibly content. She curled up on her blanket near the fire, her tail wagging faintly as Lucas sat beside her. Rachel placed a hand on her brother's shoulder. "You're doing good, Lucas," she said quietly. For the first time in a long while, Lucas allowed himself to believe it. The evening was still, the kind of quiet that only a small town could offer. Lucas sat on the porch, his work boots propped up on the railing, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. Layla lay on a blanket at his feet, her head resting on her paws as her eyes lazily followed the flickering shadows of trees swaying in the light breeze. For the first time in weeks, Lucas felt a semblance of peace. Layla's recovery had been slow but steady, and her once hollow eyes now gleamed with life. She had even started to venture farther from the porch, cautiously exploring the small yard surrounding the cabin. "You're getting braver every day, girl," Lucas said, leaning down to scratch behind her ears. Layla let out a contented sigh, her tail thumping softly against the wood. But the tranquility didn't last. A sudden rustling in the nearby bushes snapped Layla to attention. Her ears perked, and her body tensed as she stood, her gaze locked on the darkened tree line. Lucas sat up, following her gaze, his own sense of unease growing. "Probably just a raccoon," he muttered, though he didn't fully believe it. Before he could move, the sound of heavy footsteps approached, followed by the unmistakable slur of drunken voices. Two figures emerged from the shadows, stumbling onto the edge of the property. "Hey!" Lucas called out, standing and stepping in front of Layla. "This is private property. You need to leave." The men didn't respond right away. One of them swayed unsteadily, a bottle of something dark clutched in his hand. The other sneered, his eyes scanning the yard lazily before landing on Lucas. "Relax, man," the second man slurred, his voice dripping with mockery. "We're just passing through." "You're not passing through here," Lucas said firmly, his voice low and steady. "Turn around and leave. Now." The first man chuckled, tipping the bottle toward Lucas. "Or what? You gonna call the cops on us?" Layla let out a low growl, stepping closer to Lucas's side. Her hackles rose, and her gaze never left the intruders. Lucas placed a hand on her back, both to reassure her and to keep her calm. "I don't want trouble," Lucas said, his tone hardening, "but I suggest you leave before it finds you." The men exchanged a look before the second one took a step closer, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Easy, big guy, we're going." But as they turned, one of them grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it toward the porch. The sudden movement startled Layla, and before Lucas could react, she lunged forward, barking fiercely. Layla's bark echoed through the quiet night, sharp and forceful, sending a jolt through the two men. The rock hit the porch railing with a dull thud, but the men froze in their tracks as Layla's growl deepened, her body stiff and poised to defend. "Whoa, easy there," the man with the bottle shouted, stumbling back. His attempt at bravado faltered as he stared at the snarling dog. "Call off your mutt." Lucas stepped forward, his hand gripping Layla's leash tightly. "You threw the rock. What did you think would happen?" His voice was calm but carried an unmistakable edge. Layla stood her ground, her teeth bared, but her eyes flicked toward Lucas as if awaiting his command. Lucas knelt beside her, his hand resting on her head. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his touch steady. Slowly, her growls softened, though her gaze remained locked on the intruders. The second man, now visibly uneasy, pulled his companion by the sleeve. "Let's go, man. She's not worth it." The first man hesitated, glaring at Lucas and Layla, but as Layla took a single step forward, her growl rising again, he threw up his hands in defeat. "Fine, we're leaving." The two stumbled off into the shadows, their voices fading as they retreated. Lucas waited until the night was quiet again before letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned to Layla, who had relaxed slightly but still kept her ears perked, her body alert. "Good girl," Lucas said softly, stroking her fur. "You did good." Layla let out a small whine, her tail wagging tentatively. It was as if she was asking for reassurance. Unsure if her actions were truly right, Lucas smiled, his hand gently cupping her face. "You kept us safe, Layla. You were brave." Inside the cabin, Lucas checked Layla over to make sure she hadn't strained herself during the encounter, though she seemed uninjured. He noticed the slight tremble in her legs as the adrenaline wore off. He brought her a fresh bowl of water and sat beside her as she drank. "You surprised me out there," Lucas said, his tone filled with both pride and wonder. "You're not just recovering, you're protecting us now." Rachel arrived the next morning, her arms full of groceries and a curious expression on her face. "What happened to the porch railing?" she asked, noticing the scuff where the rock had hit. "Long story," Lucas replied, glancing at Layla, who was lying peacefully by the fire. "But let's just say Layla proved herself last night." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "She protected you?" Lucas nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "She did. She's not just healing, she's learning to trust, to be herself again." Rachel knelt beside Layla, stroking her fur gently. "You've got a fighter here, Lucas. You both do." Lucas watched Layla's eyes close in contentment, her breathing steady and calm. For the first time, he felt a deep sense of gratitude not just for saving Layla, but for how she was saving him, too. A few weeks had passed since the incident on the porch, and Layla's progress continued to amaze Lucas. She had grown stronger, her coat beginning to regain its healthy sheen, and her movements became more confident with each passing day. She followed Lucas everywhere, her trust in him unshakable. But Lucas knew there was still one hurdle left to overcome, for both of them. The river. It had been haunting Lucas ever since he pulled Layla from its icy grip. The memories of that night were intertwined with the guilt he carried from his days as a firefighter, the one rescue he couldn't complete, the one life he couldn't save. He had avoided going near the water ever since. But he also knew he couldn't let the fear control him anymore. Layla had her own reasons to fear the river. Lucas noticed how she froze at the sound of rushing water whenever they walked near the creek behind the cabin. Her body would stiffen, her eyes wide with alarm. He saw himself in her reaction, the way fear had held them both captive. One crisp morning, Lucas stood on the porch, the leash in his hand, as Layla sat beside him. "We're going to face it today, girl," he said softly, his voice steady but uncertain. Layla tilted her head, sensing his unease, but she didn't resist as he clipped the leash to her collar. The walk to the river was quiet, the sound of rustling leaves and chirping birds accompanying them. As they approached the water, Lucas felt his chest tighten. The river was calm now, its surface glinting under the morning sun, but the memories of its fury were still fresh in his mind. Layla hesitated as they neared the bank, her paws digging into the dirt. Lucas knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on her back. "It's okay," he whispered. "We're just going to look. Nothing's going to hurt you." With a gentle tug, Lucas encouraged her forward. Layla took one shaky step, then another, her eyes fixed on the water. When they reached the edge, she stopped, her body trembling. Lucas crouched beside her, his own heart pounding. "It's just water," he said, more to himself than to Layla. "It can't hurt us now." For a moment, neither of them moved. The river's gentle current lapped at the shore, the sound both soothing and intimidating. Lucas took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus on the present. He reached down, picking up a smooth stone from the ground, and skipped it across the surface. Layla's ears twitched at the sound, her gaze following the ripples. Lucas smiled faintly. "See? It's not so bad." Layla lowered her head, sniffing cautiously at the edge of the water. It was a small step, but Lucas felt a surge of pride. They were both facing their fears, together. Lucas stayed crouched by the riverbank, his hand resting gently on Layla's back. She sniffed at the water again, her nose twitching as if testing its scent for danger. For a moment, she seemed almost curious, but then a sudden gust of wind sent a shiver through her body, and she backed away, her tail tucked tightly between her legs. "It's okay," Lucas said softly, his voice steady despite the lump forming in his throat. He moved closer, sitting on the ground beside her. "We're not in a rush, Layla. We'll take it one step at a time." He glanced at the river, its calm surface so different from the raging torrent that had almost taken her life. But for Lucas, the calm water still felt like a reminder of his own failure. He clenched his fists, the memories of that fateful day as a firefighter creeping back unbidden, the screams on the radio, the sight of smoke billowing from the building, and the crushing weight of knowing he hadn't saved everyone. Layla whimpered softly, pulling Lucas from his thoughts. He looked down at her and realized his tension had passed to her. Forcing himself to relax, he reached out and scratched behind her ears. "Sorry, girl," he murmured. "This isn't just about you, is it?" As the minutes ticked by, Lucas let Layla dictate the pace. He tossed another pebble into the water, watching as it skipped once before sinking. Layla's ears perked up slightly, her head tilting as she watched the ripples. "You see that?" Lucas asked, his voice carrying a note of encouragement. "It's not so scary, is it?" Layla inched closer, her movements slow and deliberate. When her paw finally touched the wet edge of the riverbank, Lucas felt his breath catch. She froze, her body tense, but then she looked back at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "You're brave, Layla," Lucas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've always been brave." Encouraged by his tone, Layla leaned forward and dipped her nose into the water. The cold startled her, and she jerked back slightly, but she didn't retreat completely. Instead, she licked her nose, tasting the water, and then leaned forward again. "That's it," Lucas said, his voice filled with pride. For the first time, he felt a shift in himself as well. He realized that encouraging Layla to face her fears was helping him confront his own. The river no longer seemed like an enemy. It was a part of their story, a reminder of how far they had come together. When Layla finally stepped into the shallow water, her paws sinking slightly into the mud, Lucas couldn't help but smile. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was moving forward. As Layla stood in the shallow water, her legs trembling but steady. Lucas felt a surge of pride swell in his chest. The river, once a source of fear for both of them, now felt less menacing. It was a small step, but it symbolized something much larger, a shared resilience, a willingness to confront the shadows of their past. Layla's nose dipped toward the water's surface, her reflection rippling as she lapped at it cautiously. Lucas watched her, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and admiration. "You're doing it, girl," he said softly, his voice tinged with awe. But then a loud, sudden noise shattered the moment. The sharp crack of a branch snapping underfoot echoed through the stillness, followed by the sound of rustling leaves. Layla jerked her head up, her body stiffening as her instincts took over. Lucas turned sharply toward the source of the noise, his heart racing. Emerging from the trees was a man, a hiker. Judging by his gear, but his sudden appearance and heavy footsteps startled Layla. She backed out of the water quickly, her paws slipping on the mud as a low growl rumbled in her throat. "Whoa, easy," the hiker called out, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Didn't mean to scare you." Lucas stepped between Layla and the man, his hand reaching for her leash. "It's okay, Layla," he murmured, his voice calm and reassuring. He turned to the hiker, his expression tense but controlled. "She's still a little nervous around strangers." The man nodded, taking a cautious step back. "Understandable. Sorry to intrude." He gestured toward the river. "Beautiful spot, though. Looks like you've got a good dog there." Lucas glanced down at Layla, who had stopped growling but remained close to his side, her body pressed against his leg. "Yeah," he said quietly, "she's a good one." As the hiker disappeared back into the trees, Lucas knelt beside Layla, his hands gently stroking her fur. "You're okay," he said softly. "It's over now." Layla's tense posture began to relax, and she leaned into his touch, her eyes searching his face for reassurance. The encounter had shaken them both, but it also reinforced something Lucas had come to realize: trust was a fragile thing, built slowly and tested often. Layla had trusted him to keep her safe, just as he had trusted her to push through her fear. They sat by the riverbank for a while longer, the sun climbing higher in the sky. The water sparkled, its gentle current carrying away the remnants of their hesitation. For the first time, Lucas felt a sense of closure, not just for Layla, but for himself. The river was no longer a symbol of failure. It was a reminder of second chances. When they finally stood to leave, Layla took a final, deliberate step into the water. She paused, looking back at Lucas as if to say, "I'm ready." Lucas smiled, his voice steady and full of pride. "Yeah, me too." Together, they turned and walked away from the river, leaving the shadows of the past behind them. The days following their visit to the river were transformative, not just for Layla but for Lucas as well. There was a new energy in their routine, a sense of progress that had been hard to imagine during those early, fragile days. Layla, once too weak to stand, now moved confidently around the cabin, her tail wagging with a steady rhythm that Lucas had come to cherish. One morning, Lucas decided it was time for a new challenge. He had heard from Rachel about a nearby park with open fields and quiet trails, an ideal spot for Layla to explore beyond the safety of their yard. "What do you think, girl?" Lucas asked, kneeling to clip her leash onto her collar. "Ready for your first big adventure?" Layla wagged her tail enthusiastically, her bright eyes meeting his with an expression that seemed to say, "Let's go." The drive to the park was peaceful, the crisp morning air streaming through the truck's open windows. Layla sat in the passenger seat, her nose pressed against the glass as she took in the new sights and smells. For Lucas, it was a simple but profound moment, a reminder of how far they had come. When they arrived, Lucas chose a trail that wound through the woods and opened into a sprawling meadow. Layla hesitated at first, her paws faltering on the unfamiliar path, but Lucas stayed close, offering quiet words of encouragement. Step by step, she grew more confident, her nose constantly sniffing at the ground and her ears twitching at every sound. As they reached the meadow, Lucas unhooked Layla's leash, crouching beside her. "Go on," he said softly, gesturing toward the open field. "It's all yours." Layla hesitated for a moment, glancing back at Lucas. When he nodded, she took off, her legs carrying her in wide, graceful arcs across the grass. Lucas watched her with a mixture of pride and awe. This was the same dog he had pulled from the icy river, the same dog who had cowered at every noise. Now, she was running free, her joy unmistakable. The sound of her bark brought Lucas out of his thoughts. She had stopped near a cluster of wildflowers, her nose buried in the blooms as she let out a series of playful yips. Lucas couldn't help but laugh, a sound that felt foreign after so many months of worry and self-doubt. "You're amazing, Layla," he called out, his voice carrying across the meadow. Layla ran back to him, her tail wagging furiously. She plopped down at his feet, panting but content, her eyes shining with happiness. Lucas knelt beside her, scratching behind her ears. "You're not just surviving anymore," he said, his voice soft. "You're living." As they made their way back to the truck, Lucas felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. Layla had found her strength, and in helping her, he had rediscovered his own. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of growth and small victories. Layla's strength and confidence blossomed with each passing day. Lucas found himself marveling at her resilience, her ability to find joy in even the simplest moments. A patch of sunlight on the floor, a squirrel darting up a tree, or a new toy that Rachel had brought over. One evening, as Lucas sat by the fire reading, Layla trotted over with her leash in her mouth. She dropped it at his feet and wagged her tail, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Lucas laughed, setting his book aside. "You want to go out?" "Ha?" he asked, reaching down to clip the leash onto her collar. "All right, girl. Let's see what the evening has in store for us." The two ventured into the yard, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The air was crisp, the kind that carried the faint smell of leaves and earth. Lucas let Layla lead the way, her nose low to the ground as she explored the familiar space with renewed curiosity. As they neared the edge of the property, Lucas noticed the faint sound of rushing water in the distance. It was the creek that fed into the river, a place they had avoided since that pivotal day. Layla paused, her ears twitching as the sound reached her. She turned to Lucas, her gaze questioning but calm. "Want to check it out?" Lucas asked, his voice gentle. He crouched beside her, stroking her fur. "We don't have to if you're not ready." Layla stood still for a moment, her tail swaying slowly as if she were weighing the decision. Then, with a small wag, she stepped forward, leading Lucas toward the creek. When they arrived, the water was clear and gentle, its surface reflecting the twilight sky. Layla approached cautiously, her steps deliberate but steady. Lucas stayed a few feet behind, watching as she sniffed at the edge, her paws pressing into the cool, damp earth. "That's my girl," Lucas said softly, pride swelling in his chest. Layla dipped her nose into the water, then looked back at Lucas with an expression that seemed almost triumphant. Lucas smiled, feeling a familiar sense of peace settle over him. The creek no longer felt like a reminder of fear. It was a symbol of progress, of healing. As they walked back to the cabin, the stars began to appear in the night sky, their light casting a gentle glow over the landscape. Layla trotted beside Lucas, her tail wagging contentedly. "You've come so far, Layla," Lucas said, his voice full of quiet admiration. "And you've brought me along with you." Layla let out a soft bark as if to agree, her gaze meeting his with unwavering trust. For Lucas, it was more than a moment. It was a promise that the past no longer held them captive. The morning light streamed through the cabin windows as Lucas sipped his coffee, watching Layla nap peacefully near the fireplace. Her chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, a stark contrast to the shallow breaths she had struggled with weeks ago. She looked strong now, her coat gleaming in the sunlight and her body relaxed, no longer weighed down by fear or exhaustion. Rachel arrived later that day, carrying a box of supplies and an envelope in her hand. "You're becoming a bit of a local celebrity," she said with a grin, setting the box on the kitchen counter. Lucas raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" Rachel held up the envelope. It's from the Elkhorn Community Center. They're organizing a fundraiser for the local animal shelter, and they want you and Layla to be the guests of honor." Lucas blinked, surprised. "Why us?" "Because your story is inspiring." "Lucas," Rachel said, her tone softening, "you saved Layla, and she's proof that even the most broken things can heal. People need to hear that." Lucas hesitated, glancing at Layla, who had woken up and was now watching him with her bright, trusting eyes. He felt a knot of uncertainty in his chest. He wasn't used to attention, to being seen as anything more than an ordinary man trying to make amends. But then he thought about Layla's journey, about how far they had come together. If their story could inspire others to give animals like Layla a second chance, maybe it was worth stepping out of his comfort zone. "All right," Lucas said finally, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "We'll do it." The fundraiser was held at the park where Layla had first run freely across the meadow. Families and friends gathered, their laughter and conversations filling the air. Booths lined the paths, offering everything from homemade treats to pet adoption signups. When it was time for Lucas and Layla to take the stage, Lucas felt a pang of nervousness, but as Layla stood beside him, her tail wagging steadily, he found the courage he needed. "Layla's story isn't just about survival," Lucas began, his voice steady. "It's about second chances for her and for me. She reminded me that healing is a journey, not a destination, and she showed me that trust, love, and patience can overcome anything." The crowd erupted into applause as Lucas crouched beside Layla, giving her a gentle pat. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment as Layla leaned into him, her eyes bright with happiness. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lucas and Layla returned home. Sitting together on the porch, they watched the stars emerge one by one. The night was quiet, peaceful, and filled with a sense of completion. "You're not just a survivor, Layla," Lucas said, his voice soft but full of emotion. "You're my family." Layla rested her head on his lap, letting out a contented sigh. In that moment, Lucas knew that their journey wasn't just about overcoming the past. It was about building a future, one step at a time. The days that followed the fundraiser were filled with quiet moments of reflection for Lucas. The outpouring of support from the community had been overwhelming, but it was Layla's reaction that stuck with him the most. She had walked through the crowd with a calm confidence, her tail wagging and her head held high. It was as if she understood the role she played, not just as a survivor but as a symbol of hope for others. One afternoon, Lucas sat on the porch with Rachel, sipping iced tea as Layla dozed in a patch of sunlight nearby. The cabin was quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. "You've come a long way," Rachel said, breaking the silence. Lucas glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. "Me or Layla?" "Both of you," Rachel replied with a smile. "You've changed, Lucas. You're lighter now, I guess, like you finally let go of something you were carrying." Lucas looked down at his hands, turning her words over in his mind. She wasn't wrong. For years, he had carried the weight of his past, every mistake, every failure, every moment he thought he wasn't enough. But Layla had taught him something he hadn't expected, that healing wasn't about erasing the past but learning to live with it. "She taught me more than I ever thought possible," Lucas said, his voice quiet. "When I found her, I thought I was saving her, but she ended up saving me." Rachel nodded, her gaze softening. "Sometimes that's how it works. We don't always realize what we need until it finds us." Lucas leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting to Layla. Her breathing was steady, her body relaxed, and her face serene. She looked at peace, and for the first time in a long while, Lucas felt the same. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Lucas and Layla took their usual walk to the creek. The water glinted under the fading light, its gentle flow a reminder of how far they had come. Layla approached the edge with ease now, her paws dipping into the cool water without hesitation. Lucas crouched beside her, watching as she explored the shallow stream. "You've got no fear left, do you?" he asked, a smile tugging at his lips. Layla looked up at him briefly before returning her focus to the water, her tail wagging lazily. The creek had become a place of closure for them both. What was once a symbol of pain and struggle was now a reminder of resilience and renewal. It wasn't just a place where they confronted their fears. It was a place where they learned to move past them. As the seasons began to change, Lucas and Layla fell into a comfortable rhythm. Each day was a blend of quiet moments and new adventures. Walks through the woods, lazy afternoons by the fire, and occasional visits from Rachel, who never failed to bring treats for Layla. Life had become simpler but fuller, filled with purpose and a sense of belonging that Lucas hadn't felt in years. One day, a letter arrived in the mail from the local animal shelter. Inside was a handwritten note from the director, thanking Lucas and Layla for their contribution to the fundraiser. Attached to the note was a photograph taken at the event. Lucas crouched beside Layla on stage, his hand resting on her back as she gazed out at the cheering crowd. Lucas stared at the photo for a long moment, a lump forming in his throat. It wasn't just a snapshot of a happy day. It was a testament to how far they'd come. He placed the photo on the mantel above the fireplace, where it joined a small collection of meaningful keepsakes. That evening, as Lucas sat on the porch, Layla curled up at his feet. He found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. He thought about the icy river, the nights of worry and doubt, and the moments of triumph that had reshaped both their lives. "You've taught me a lot, girl," Lucas said, his voice soft, about courage, about second chances, about what it means to keep going, even when it feels impossible. Layla opened one eye, her tail thumping gently against the porch floor as if to acknowledge his words. The stars began to appear, their light scattered across the vast, dark sky. Lucas felt a sense of peace settle over him, but with it came a question he hadn't dared to ask himself before. What's next? For so long, his world had revolved around Layla's recovery. But now that she was thriving, Lucas realized there was more he could do, not just for her, but for others like her. The idea of volunteering at the shelter, or perhaps even fostering another dog in need, began to take shape in his mind. "You think we're ready for that, Layla?" Lucas asked, glancing down at her. She let out a soft huff, her tail wagging in what felt like approval. Lucas smiled, the thought of a new chapter filling him with quiet excitement. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, that uncertainty felt like an opportunity rather than a burden. As the night deepened, Lucas rested his hand on Layla's back, her warmth grounding him in the present. Their story wasn't over, it was simply evolving, one step at a time. Above them, the stars continued to shine, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, light could always be found.